Perfect. Thank you, Sasha. I really appreciate it. So, hello, everyone. Welcome to Health Matters, a virtual lecture series on medicine, illness, and public health, which is sponsored by the Jordan Center for the Advanced Study of Russia at New York University. My name is Melissa Miller. I am Assistant Professor of Russian Studies at Colby College. We would like to thank the Jordan Center for sponsoring the series and Sasha Spitalnik for her technical expertise in hosting our event. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Tom Dolack. He is currently a student advisor at Wheaton College in Massachusetts. For the past 20 years, he had taught Russian language and comparative literature at the universities of Oregon, Chicago, and Pennsylvania, and the Middlebury Summer Language Program, as well as Wheaton College. He has published on translation theory, cognitive and evolutionary approaches to literature, Pushkin, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Mandelstam, and Petrarch and Unamuno, among other topics. Today's talk, entitled The Next Small Things, Russian Literature and Cognitive Science, presents research from Dr. Dolack's recently published edited volume, Russian Literature and Cognitive Science from Lexington Books. The talk will apply the newest insights from cognitive psychology to the study of Russian literature. It focused on writers and cultural figures from the golden to the internet age, including Pushkin and Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Sologub, Bely, and Akhmatova, as well as Nabokov, Baranskaya, and contemporary online discourse. Dolack will discuss a wide array of cognitively informed fields within psychology and related disciplines, and approaches such as social psychology, the study of autism, cognitive approaches to creativity, the medical humanities, cognitive anthropology, psychopathology, and psychoanalysis. So it's a lot, and I'm really excited to hear more. Our format today will be as follows. Dr. Tolak will speak for about 50 minutes, and then we will open up the discussion to questions from the audience for about 30 minutes. If you have a question, please raise your hand and I'll call on you to unmute and ask your question. You can also type it in the chat and I'll read it out loud for Dr. Dolack to respond to. So, Dr. Dolack, thank you so much for being with us here today. I'll turn things over to you now and you can just begin whenever you are ready.
Thank you very much, Melissa. The book is now over a year old, and of course, the work for it is now kind of 2 years old. So I kind of feel like I'm getting in the time warp here to get back into this mode. But I'm thrilled for the opportunity to do so. Um, Share here. All right. If anything is not working the way it should be, somebody please yell at me. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Melissa and MedCease for the invitation, and thank you to the Jordan Center for hosting. I am here in my capacity as editor of this volume, Russian Literature and Cognitive Science, published by Lexington Books last year, or a little bit over a year ago. It is the first collection devoted to the union of those two fields, although there have been a few book-length monographs on the topic by Brett Cook and most recently by David Bethea, as well as a good amount of smaller works. I was asked to run through the genesis of the volume and its contents, as well as to give an overview of cognitive approaches to literature in general. I am happy to do so, although my particular Petichi Palyot will be necessarily idiosyncratic. I'll start with the origins of the volume. So dating myself here, but about 20 years ago, Brett and I started organizing ATSEAL and AAASS/ASSIS panels on the topic. It was more him than me back then. We started off with a small group of regulars, me, Olga Cook. We could get Brian Boyd and Danielle Rain-Laferriere on occasion. As most of you probably know, Daniel comes from more of a psychoanalytic perspective, but I see him as a fellow traveler, even if some of the assumptions of psychoanalysis are very different. But as the years went by, we started to attract new people, which was a really good sign. The numbers have always been up and down. One year we even managed to have 3 panels, but we could usually field 2 at the major conferences. At this point, we figured that there was enough interest that we should bring some of the work together into one place. I'll point out that there was also some spillover from the volume into Tolstoy Studies Journal. My thanks to Tatiana Gershkovich for her support there. The original idea for the volume was Brett's, but he had other projects in mind, and so he kind of handed it off to me for better or for worse. I would argue for worse, but that's fine. I settled on Lexington Press, which is now part of Bloomsbury, because they had a relevant series. It wasn't going to cost anything. I wasn't going to be able to get a subvention. And I was convinced that they weren't going to try to micromanage the volume in any way. I'd heard some stories about other presses kind of meddling. I was pretty convinced they were going to let me do what I wanted to do with the volume. So the stars aligned for the project. I went through the various stages. It took maybe a little under 2 years to go from my first call from chapters in the winter of 22-23 to having a copy in our hands. As for the why of the volume, I'll speak here just for myself, but I thought that there was enough work being done in isolated places that it would be useful for the field to bring the work together to try to get a bit of coherence. I'll discuss the centripetal forces at work in a second, but I felt the need to produce something to pull inward when all of the different work being done was pulling outward. On the whole, I think it's a good and healthy thing to avoid consolidating around a single approach, but too much outward pull and you break apart and don't really have a field worth the name. So this way, there is now a text that people can use as a starting point for the field, and it might lend some coherence and mutual communication going forward. Before I get to the different chapters of the book, let me talk more generally about cognitive approaches to literature. What I am going to say here is going to be very particular to me. This is my idiosyncratic estimation of the field, but then I suppose that's what you're paying for, so that's what you get. Perhaps I should start with the word cognitive. What does that mean? In short, it just has to do with how the brain processes information, including sensory information. It does not necessarily, although it can, refer specifically to the firing of neurons, neurotransmitters, or the various gyri and sulci of the brain. By the way, just to give an example of the complexity of such discussion, here is a cross-section of a synaptic bulb. That's the little knob at the end of an axon. This is perhaps my favorite image from a neuroscience paper. I'm not sure how well you can see it, but all of those different colors are different parts, right? They do something different. And that's just one end of one axon on one neuron. They're all different. So that's just an idea of just the complexity of what we're dealing with, how many different things there are. So a cognitive approach to literature is one that applies the workings of the brain to the study of literature. Let me give a specific example of the brain in action. Does everybody remember this picture? This is, of course, the famous blue, black, or white gold dress from back in 2015, right? Remember, this was like the entire internet for like a good while back then. This is a good example of how our mental representation of something is never just a copy of reality. Information in the brain is always incomplete, always needs processing, and so can lead to different results, different interpretations. In this case, what is lacking in this picture is information about the location of the lighting. And so our brains must assume that this dress is either directly lit or lit from above and thus casting a shadow. Our visual processing system knows that the exact shade of color will differ depending on the lighting, and so will adjust our experience accordingly. If we assume direct lighting, we see brightly lit black and blue. If we assume the dress is in shadow, we see white and gold, because blue and black is what actually hits our retinas when white and gold is in shadow. Different assumptions, different conscious experiences, but the picture itself is exactly the same. And here's where things get really interesting for me. They did studies, and apparently which one you see is influenced by whether you spend a lot of time indoors and therefore are used to direct lighting, or whether you spend a lot of time outdoors and therefore you're used to the sun casting shadows. Right? I see blue and black, for instance, because I spend a lot of time indoors. So our personal history and environment has a direct influence on what our brain does and what we experience. And this is just a picture of a dress. The types of cultural artifacts that we are generally interested in are, of course, vastly more complex than this one example. Now for a digression on the history of the field. If you look at the history of cognitive science, it emerges as a reaction to behavioralism in the 50s. Behaviorism, particularly the work of B.F. Skinner, focused on looking at animals, including humans, as if they were complicated versions of the dogs experimented on by Ivan Pavlov. I'm assuming that name rings a bell. Uh, Here's the problem with Zoom. I can't tell whether the joke actually lands or not. But fun fact, Pavlov actually used metronomes, not bells. And I think if you look closely at the picture, I think there's one on the desk in the corner there, but I can't quite tell. Um, so using this approach, you get experiments that bleed into animal abuse, like getting pigeons addicted to gambling. Such experiments only get you so far, and so eventually people realize that you need to take things like environment and social relations into consideration, even for simple organisms. I want to mention this because cognitive science these days, at least in certain quarters of academia, has the reputation of being reductionist in the negative sense of that term, or of being overly focused on the brain and ignoring the myriad of other influences on human behavior. But the origins of the field position it as the field that, in fact, took all of that into consideration, right? They were reacting to a field that was not doing that. I think that's important because it's one of the things I find useful about the approach. It is wide and there is room for it to take into consideration all of the things that we as humanists value. By the 80s, there began to emerge literary approaches informed by the new science. Reuven Sur even has some work that goes back to the 70s. The earlier work usually goes by the name of cognitive poetics. It has at least one of its feet firmly planted in linguistics, especially the work of Lakoff and Johnson on conceptual metaphor, that looks at how thinking is affected by the metaphors we use to navigate the world, such as things are looking up or I'm looking forward to my break. As the field progressed, it steadily broadened as cognitive science itself broadened, refined its tools, and was applied to more and more areas of intellectual inquiry. The walls between different branches of psychology have become more porous. Cognitive science has a foot in developmental psychology, one in social psychology, one in abnormal psychology, evolutionary psychology, etc. You name it. I know that's a lot of feet. That's probably more of a spider. And then there are cognitive approaches to anthropology and archaeology, economics. Don't call it neuroeconomics. They're picky about that. It's behavioral economics, to art, to history, to philosophy, just about everything. Each of these fields has developed their own methodologies and their own uses of the science. They all examine human behavior, and they all have found ways of looking at that behavior from a cognitive perspective. And here is where I think my own personal approach to the field differs from some of my colleagues, and also where I'm glad to be working in Russian literature, where this approach is newer and therefore less ossified. I think that a cognitive approach to literature should draw not just directly on psychology, but on all of the fields that have drawn on the science. For instance, one of the most productive areas of my own research comes out of religious studies, where minimally counterintuitive imagery is an important concept. I'll return to this in a second, but I didn't need to create a methodology to do this work. That was already done. I could just take it from where it was done over here and start applying it to new texts. Let me lay out the logic here just a bit more explicitly. Producing culture is a behavior. Cultural artifacts, be they literature or music or art or film or dance or whatever, are produced by human beings. And like everything we do, it is influenced by the functioning of our brains within a particular environmental context, including other human beings and our own bodies. A brain in a jar would not be a mind. We need our bodies need other bodies, and bodies need an environment. There are ways that every level of influence, cultural, socioeconomic, historical, evolutionary, affect us cognitively. There is no other choice because all behavior is mediated by our brain. There is a cognitive aspect to the effects of poverty, to the effects of class antagonism, environmental pollution, early education, family background, the amount of social stability in a society. At this point, the different subfields of psychology have examined pretty much any element of an artist's background that we as humanists like to discuss, but from a cognitive perspective. Furthermore, some other field has probably also tried to apply that work to some aspect of human behavior already. What that means is that there's tons of work out there ripe for the picking that literary scholars can take and apply to what we are interested in. There is definitely some low-hanging fruit available for enterprising grad students. And there's the added benefit that the anthropologists or religious studies people or art historians or whoever have already digested the hard science, which means you don't necessarily need to get too deep into things like readiness potentials and Hebbian plasticity. A few examples that I have been thinking about recently, largely in connection with Dostoevsky, are how consciousness studies show how what we experience, including what we experience vicariously through fiction, becomes part of our self, a self that then goes out to act differently in the world. Cognitive approaches to religion point out these spiritual technologies that have been honed over millennia to bring societies together and handle the difficult parts of life, an idea that I think Dostoevsky intuited. Imitation is a key concept in psychology and anthropology and is increasingly well understood in its developmental and social context. There is potential here to inform what is perhaps the most fundamental concept in literary theory, mimesis. Psychology even makes certain predictions that can be tested against literary examples. For instance, the new field of weird, Western educated, industrial, rich, democratic psychology makes a distinction between guilt, failure to live up to an internalized personal rule typical of modern Western societies, and shame, a more public failure that must be atoned for publicity, typical of non-Western societies. And that's a distinction that I think you can see in different writers at different times. And then there's possibly my favorite example. Cognitive approaches to religion are fond of the example of minimally counterintuitive imagery. I will ignore the minimally part. I'm not convinced that the minimally is important, but counterintuitive imagery is imagery that violates our ontological expectations. We innately, what exactly innate means is a whole separate discussion I don't quite have time for here, but it's more complicated than it sounds like. We innately expect things to not move or change on their own and to obey basic physics. We expect plants to grow and be able to be eaten. We expect animals to have some thoughts in their head, move on their own, make copies of themselves, eat other things, and to be eaten. Tools are made by people for a specific function. And people do everything that animals do, plus have a full inner life, including speech, and make tools. When something doesn't fit these patterns, we find it interesting and more memorable, right? This is a large advantage in oral cultures. A mind without a body, or an animal that talks, or a stick that heals is inherently interesting. That's something, there's something cognitively optimal in a way that can be measured about such imagery. The field focuses on examples from religion, and understandably so. The most obvious examples are religious. Obvious examples include spirits and gods and burning bushes. But when I look at the research, I don't see a tool of religion. I see a tool of narrative. These are all things that make stories more memorable, and that is co-opted by religion, right? So it's not religious, it's about religious narratives. There is nothing inherently religious about the counterintuitive imagery, but it is inherently literary. There's an entire possible research program in examining the rates of such imagery in corpora of texts. Now, for one of the big questions about this research, why would you want to use it? As a preamble, let me say that personally, I am against isms. I think generally schools of thought lead to a rush of new ideas at first, but over time they interfere with new ideas. I am a bricoleur by nature, so I personally do not want to put cognitive approaches to literature forward as a specific school, as the next big thing. I prefer to think of this as a collection of small things that maybe can add up to a medium-sized thing. That's the reason that I am careful to say approaches in the plural. So what is it worth then? For me, any approach or school of thought is like a lens. Lenses can bring into focus things that were previously blurry or not even visible, but they can also distort what could already be seen quite clearly. If you don't already know what you're looking at, it can be hard to tell the difference. So now for the what for. One response is that cognitive approaches to literature do something that literary studies has been doing for a long time. It applies an understanding of how the mind works to the actions of authors, readers, and literary characters. Isn't that basically what psychoanalytic approaches do? Cognitive science is just another such approach. But whereas psychoanalysis did not peer into the black box of the mind, because it couldn't, it formed before the technology existed, but tried to figure out the workings of the mind based on patients and therapy, cognitive science uses more recent tools like fMRIs, as well as a better understanding for the parts and interworkings of the brain and its evolutionary history to explain what goes on in our internal lives. I do want to point out that I don't want to establish neuroscience as a capital S science that is infallible. There are lots of squabbles in the field. Experiments contradict each other. The entire field of psychology is currently, or should currently be, going through some soul searching in the wake of what has been called a replication crisis. Fundamental experiments, including ones in introductory textbooks, have failed to replicate under more stringent controls. Things like priming effects, ego depletion, the Stanford prison experiment. There is no psychology says here, but there can be consensus on certain issues based on hundreds, sometimes thousands of independent experiments. There are things we can be pretty confident about, even if we can always learn about certain aspects of those things. This can give us firm enough ground to build interpretations of it on, even if we get some tremors now and then. But should we even care about this as literary scholars? Aren't the arts and psychology far enough apart that we can do without the PET scans? My response is we may not need them, but they can come in handy. Here's one example. When we discuss art, we're discussing human behavior, even if it is the virtual behavior of made-up humans represented by ink smudges on paper. And so all interpretation of art will make assumptions about humans behave, and some of those assumptions will match better with what psychology currently claims is reality. By having a sense for what those claims are, we can weed out which interpretations about art are more likely. And I want to use statistical language here, not categorical language. This is a more likely to, not a definitely will. And we do this in order to match all of this with how our brains work within a specific environment. I have previously used the analogy of a slalom gate that can separate out theories that are too removed from what we know about human minds. I am open to that gate being rather wide. I also want to say that there is a level of discussion that is not always useful or interesting. Most of the time, we only care about whether an interpretation is interesting or productive or makes us see something new. But there are times when connection with reality is good as well. My take is that there should be some subset of the discipline of literary studies that has a foot in contemporary psychology so that it can make those ideas accessible. I do not want to argue that all literary scholars should at all times be worried about the most recent articles in Nature Reviews Neuroscience. My PhD was in comparative literature, so I'll say that, in that capacity that I think there should always be people in a field who work in other fields so they can import new ideas. Without the pollination of those bees, those flowers in those fields start to die. Everybody doesn't need to do that kind of work by any stretch of the imagination, but some need to, and I find contemporary psychology to be a rich source of new ideas. Also, it's just another source of interpretation. Cognitive science provides theories about how people interact, how the outside world influences individuals and groups, how selves develop. These are all rich sources of literary interpretation. Thinking about why Raskolnikov killed Alyona and Lizaveta Ivanovna. Cognitive science has things to say about the genetic inheritance of antisocial behaviors, about the influence of environmental pollution on a developing brain, the influence of signs of societal degradation on individual behavior. The whole topic of free will in neuroscience appears to just be exiting a mini renaissance. But I will add here, and this may be reassuring or disappointing, not sure which, but these studies generally don't contradict our received wisdom. There will be no overturning of apple carts here, but the studies can point to some subtleties that can be productively applied. The psychology is moving behind attention-grabbing, counterintuitive headlines, because those are the ones that get the clicks, and getting more into the subtleties of not just what makes us do certain things, but under what conditions. That's the interesting part for me. Let me move on to the volume, as I do want to spend as much time on my colleagues' work as possible, as it deserves attention. When I organized the chapters, I was faced with the issue that most of them did not fall neatly into logical groups that could be used to structure the volume, right? Usually a volume has like section 1, section 2, section 3. There was just too much variety for that. But I always saw that as a strength and something that I was going for all along. I wanted to include as many different approaches and as many different methodologies as I could. The only real red thread was a bunch of articles on Anna Karenina, and as I said, I pushed them into Tolstoy Studies Journal. So my organizing principle was to put the papers roughly in order by breadth of methodology, starting with evolutionary approaches, then more social psychology inflected approaches, and then leading into more individually focused subdisciplines. Thus, I start off with David Bethea's work on the Station Master. The chapter is excerpted from his very interesting The Pushkin Project, which recently won the Best Contribution in Pedagogy Prize from ATSEAL. I think David's piece is a good example of what a cognitive or evolutionary approach can do. It's not going to reveal something completely new, right? These texts have been read hundreds, thousands of times, but it can direct our attention to things that we've overlooked. David uses an evolutionary approach to mate selection to focus on the role Dunya's choices play in the story. Popular accounts of evolution usually focus on the survival part of evolution, but the theory of sexual selection focuses more on mating choices. And here it's not an issue of strongest and fastest, but an issue of aesthetics. Who is the most attractive? And in many species, it's the female that makes the choice, giving them a good deal of power, just the subtle kind of power we frequently don't appreciate. Violence and power may grab more attention, like Onegin and Lenski shooting at each other, but it's not always what drives the plot. David Danaher applies Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's theory of flow to the mowing scene in Anna Karenina, and if you have any familiarity with that theory, that should click immediately for you. This is another example of where a new lens can make us see new connections, even for a scene that has been studied lots and lots of times, as the mowing scene certainly has. David teases out parallels between Csikszentmihalyi's approach and some of the standard approaches to Tolstoy, such as Gustafson's. For instance, he insightfully points out similarities in how Tolstoy's characters become aware of the divine and the self-expanding properties of creativity. Both involve an at least temporary erasure of the self. He finishes up by doing something I think is quite useful. He applies his approach to pedagogy. It's important to remember that while we're applying this research to people who don't exist, the research is based on actual people. And so our insights into fictive minds should be able to cut both ways and be applicable to real live people. He says that students should learn about the scene in the same way that Levin learns, by finding a way of connecting personal meaning with general meaning. Staying with Tolstoy, Sarah Moeller draws on the best understood aspect of our cognition, visual processing, to look at the visual imagery in War and Peace. She argues that Tolstoy makes us co-experience the imagery, which in turn helps his readers develop their own ethical prowess. Sarah does something that I enjoy seeing in cognitive and evolutionary papers, and something that I don't think other approaches bother themselves with much. She starts with an interesting observation about Tolstoy, that the good characters can remember facial features while the less good ones have trouble with that. There's a connection between how the characters are described and their moral qualities, which is always important when discussing Tolstoy. Then she makes a parallel with how our brains do the same thing. In this case, Tolstoy's description of this remembering of faces seems to match how our brains actually process faces. This is an entire subgenre of the field, pointing out how authors anticipated findings in psychology by decades or centuries. But what I like about it is it gives an explanation for why a literary technique works. This is a level of explanation we humanists don't usually operate on. We're usually concerned with how things work in a text and not why they work in our brains. Sarah does both of these things, which I think is lovely. My own chapter was hard to place. I call it a multi-level approach to Eugene Onegin. I realized as I was writing it that it's actually more of a précis of a larger work, so I was trying to cram too much into too small of a space. But I try to show how a cognitive approach, or a collection of them, again, always the plural, could work on different levels of examination, from the historical and social influences on Pushkin himself to the specific formal aspects of the work. I look at Pushkin, the author, which I subdivide into his biography, his place in the literary tradition, Pushkin's creativity, some might use the word genius, and his personality. Then I look at socio-historical influences, which I break down into interpersonal connections and his cultural and demographic context. Then I look at Onegin, the character, which requires viewing him as if he were a real human being, which is, there are issues with that, but on the other hand, it's also something we do naturally when we read fiction. Due to space, I focus specifically on the duel. Violence and the other side of the coin, cooperation, are highly studied aspects of human behavior. I note, among other things, drawing on the work of Nisbet and Sapolsky, that the seemingly bizarre behavior of both Lenski and Onegin makes more sense from the perspective of honor. In certain environments, and that part is important, a man's honor has a value above his own life and so is worth fighting to the death over. As it happens, Russia, for a part of its history, seems to match just that kind of environment. What seems key to me is that it's the countryside that fits that bill, not Petersburg. And so Onegin misplays his hand because he operates due to city norms and not country norms. Finally, I look at something more typical for cognitive poetics, the rhyme scheme of the Onegin stanza, to argue that the flexibility of its structure is perfect for a form that needs to carry a work of about 400 stanzas. It's almost tailor-made for overcoming habituation. As I said, that's a lot in a short space, but my overall point is that cognitive science has expanded into enough domains that it can shed light on many different things, including whatever aspect of a text you might happen to be interested in. Ekaterina Chelpanova works within cognitive narratology, where one of the leading figures just happens to be named David Herman, not to be confused with our David Herman. She looks at how narrative constructs an author's worldview, looking specifically at honor in The Queen of Spades and The Coffin Maker. She focuses on how things like the use of grammar and rhetorical devices create a sense of alienation and emotional distance. I liked Katya's chapter because in some respects it's the kind of literary analysis that we're used to, but it's informed by cognitive narratology, and so it supplies a good example for others of what can be done within the field, even if you don't want to learn an entire new subfield of knowledge. Katerina Kukinova builds on a shared fruitful topic in cognitive science and literary theory, gaps. She builds up a theory of cognitive reader reception that she applies to Nabokov's Vein sisters. I think Kate's work is important in the volume because it focuses on the reader. It's important to remember that we have three people we can analyze from a cognitive perspective: the author, the character, and the reader. My sense is that that last one gets the least attention, which is kind of ironic since we are the reader. You'd think that would be our primary concern. She also does something I like to see, which is the pairing of classical literary theory, in this case, Wolfgang Iser, and contemporary psychological experiments. Here, the guerrilla experiment of Chabris and Simmons, where people fail to see a gorilla walk through a scene of people passing a basketball back and forth because they're so focused on the game, right? That would be an example of a gap. Kelly Nickmeyer Cummings comes appropriately enough for us here from more of a medical humanities background. Our chapters are getting more into social psychology here, and Kelly looks at how the reader's relationship with Peredonov in Petty Demons changes as his mental state deteriorates. She describes the narrator's medical gaze as he describes Peredonov's descent into schizophrenia. By extension, we, the reader, also try to make sense of his illness. Quote, Peredonov becomes our patient too. She draws parallels between a physician's attempt to see hidden or occult signs of disease and a symbolist's attempt to see hidden symbols in our world. To make Kelly's reading truly cognitive, she makes the connection with social cognition and theory of mind, as both are concerned with how representations influence behavioral choices. She takes things full circle by bringing in life creation and connecting back to Peredonov's diagnosis as allegory. It's a bit of a wild ride by the time you get back to the starts. I thought how Kelly connected some of the major concerns of symbolist studies like life creation to a cognitive framework provide a good model for how this can be done with other movements. Brett Cook gave us part of his larger project on the evolution of narrative technique and subjectivity. Indeed, I think at this point, Brett has written about every century of Russian literature, as well as most of the individual decades within it. Here he claims that Nabokov forces the reader to take the perspective of a protagonist with autism in the defense. He springboards off of one of Nabokov's observations that every new type of writer evolves a new type of reader. Brett specifically looks at the attempt to actively evolve readers with increasingly subtle theory of mind. His example is Nabokov making his readers identify with a protagonist who lacks metacognitive abilities. Whether Luzhin is actually or is not an autist is not actually of central concern. And so by doing this, Nabokov pushes the readers to take a perspective they likely have never taken before. Brett's broader goals fit into what I would call big literary history in the vein of big history that covers broad swaths of time, something we don't see much of anymore. Michał Mrugalski's chapter builds on an important topic in cognitive science and one that I'm surprised doesn't get more attention in cognitive approaches to literature, active inference. This is trimmed down a bit, the idea that the brain is a prediction machine because it necessarily needs to actively anticipate what will happen and fill in the gaps, more gaps, in our perceptual awareness. In order to make sense of the world, therefore, an inherent part of our internal worlds is a fiction our minds create. This is an important point because it underscores that the mind is not just an information processing device. Predicting is an active process that involves thinking things that have never happened. Michał connects all of this with what he calls terrorist realism in Bely's Petersburg. It's an approach that merges a major trend in cognitive science with historical context and with close readings of a set of texts. Irina Meyer's Ripped from the Headlines chapter looks at more contemporary violence as she connects the psychology of mass shooters to the underground man. She finds, based on her analysis of 3 recent shooters, that Dostoevsky may have been right about the unfinalizability of heinous actions. Irina's work, I think, shows that while we usually go in the direction of psychology informing literary analysis, that the arrow can and should go in the other direction as well. Psychology tends to think in terms of generalizations and averages. Literature tends to think more in terms of individuals. If great writers do present insight into the individual experience, then psychology would do well to learn from literature, as it can here. Staying on contemporary events, Anna Novikova and Julia Lerner in their joint chapter use cognitive rhetoric to study the use of online media in the months following the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. They look at the genre of the sincere conversation on YouTube talk shows in comparison with the kitchen conversations of the late Soviet period. Within that genre, they look at different kinds of metaphors, such as those about disease or those pertaining to the homeland, from the perspective of cognitive metaphor, using some of the largest figures in cognitive poetics, Lakoff, Johnson, Turner, Fauconnier, but with some Lotman thrown in as well, which definitely adds something distinctive and new to a time-honored approach. They draw everything together to make the conclusion that the combination of format and language is used to draw the audience into a community during a time of fracture. Anna and Julia's chapter shows that these approaches apply beyond just Russian literature and that we can contribute new insights to even the oldest approaches in cognitive poetics. Anna Lazareva also uses cognitive rhetoric, but applies it to patterns in dream narrative to discuss where plot structures come from. Her emphasis is not so much on the dreams themselves, but on our retelling and interpreting of them. Her approach focuses more on schemata than metaphors and is quite structuralist, but it gives insight into how we cognitively structure our narratives, in this case, narratives about dreams. I like this chapter because, one, even though I was told sort of very directly that I needed to stay within Russia, it gave me an excuse of getting a little bit outside of that, as Anna's field work was done predominantly in Ukraine. Two, it's an intriguing methodology that goes more directly to our production of narrative rather than indirectly examining it through a few isolated examples. And three, it uses field work, which not many studies do. So it was just an interesting and innovative methodology, I thought. Angelina Rubina, in her chapter, combines Lacanian psychoanalysis with the developmental psychologist Michael Tomasello's work on norm psychology to study the relationship between language, society, and individual identity in Baranskaya's Nedelya Kak Nedelya. There's some very good close analysis of the text, but also the methodology as a combination of the familiar and the new can thus serve as a bridge for scholars more used to Freud than to Pinker. Finally, in the chapter by Denis Ahopkin, Svetlaya Pamyat, Denis was one of the few in the volume to look specifically at lyric poetry. He connects Deixis am Phantasma, pointing at something that isn't there, and literary allusions, primarily in Akhmatova and Brodsky. He does something I wish the field would do more of, although the logistics of this can get tricky, and that is he did empirical studies on literary response. This requires some skills and resources that can be hard to come by, but there is immense room for original work and testing of hypotheses here. Denis comes up with some fascinating connections between reader experience, speed of comprehension, pleasure in recognizing allusions, and finally making meaning from that recognition. I could do worse than to end on Denis's closing words. Quote, cognitive approaches to literary studies cannot provide the magic key that opens all doors, but they can help us understand which set of keys can help us open a specific door or to find that door with no lock to lock. Once again, I see myself here as more of a docent, showing you around the varied work being done by others, but there is much empty room in this museum waiting to be filled. There's lots of low-hanging fruit ripe for the picking, but there isn't one big thing waiting to be discovered. It's a bunch of little things that can be recombined in many different ways. It takes some extra work to get one's footing in a field so removed from our own, but it's not as much as you might expect, and the work is so fascinating, and it easily repays the investment that I heartily suggest it. My final task here is to invite, not to lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tom. That was incredibly fascinating. And I know that certain things are now sort of suggesting themselves to me and questions to ask. So we'd like to open up the floor to questions from the audience. What I'd like to do, so everyone has the ability to unmute themselves. So the procedure I'd like to follow is if you have a question for Tom, please go ahead and raise your hand. I'll call on you and you can unmute yourself and you can and ask your question directly. If you'd prefer, you can type your question in the chat as well, and then Tom will be able to see it, and I can also read it out loud just for the benefit of everyone. So please go ahead and thinking of a question that you might have and raise your hand, and you don't have to have your camera on, you can just have your audio. Tom, while people are thinking, I've definitely been thinking of questions while you were speaking. And the first question I have is, since so many of us we work with college students, right, who are the age of Raskolnikov or around the age of Raskolnikov. Maybe that's not a comforting thought, but still. And we talk a lot, I think, now on college campuses about how cognitive science writ large tells us that the human brain, especially typically in males, matures mid 20s, right? So we're working with a population that is very motivated and very smart, but hasn't yet quite reached cognitive maturity. And my question for you, as someone who applies cognitive approaches to literature, is does that insight from cognitive science, does that give us more room to have empathy and understanding for Raskolnikov and kind of inculcate empathy and understanding for a person who is approaching a problem thinking that he's in full power of his mental faculties, but actually isn't quite there yet?
Yes, yeah, coming from someone who's much closer to the age of the underground man. Um, yeah, this gets tricky because there's this inherent kind of conflict or tension when you discuss literary characters, and that's that at the end of the day, we need to remember they're not real. Like they're fiction, like they don't have actual brains. And so it's a little tricky, like applying all of this stuff to people that don't actually exist, but we treat them as if they do. And that as if they do is like a really important and like slippery concept. And then particularly in Dostoevsky, where certainly Dostoevsky doesn't want us to excuse Dostoevsky. That's kind of the point. And I mean, I think it's a couple people in the volume actually sort of point out that it's, you know, the that we have free will, right? We can always make the choices on what we do. But to kind of just address the direct part of your question there, so I am old enough that so when I was in college and I was sort of reading this stuff, I was just getting into this stuff when people like the received wisdom was brains harden, brains don't change, that's it, you don't form new neurons, you can lose new neurons, but you don't make neurons. And so I remember when just the beginning trickles of the work that was coming out and saying, oh wait, in this like one specific instance it looks like maybe just possibly there could be new neurons firing, and that was super exciting. And then little bit by little bit, they kept finding this is if you keep track of this stuff, this is a pattern in the research over the decades. But little bit by little bit, it was like new neurons here, new neurons here, new. And all of a sudden, it was actually our brains are quite plastic, even beyond like so. One of them, yes, our brains don't mature until 20s, late 20s. That maturing process is actually more a process of losing neurons than making neurons. The brain creates just tons and tons of connections in the prefrontal cortex here. Maturing is actually more a matter of pruning the connections that it makes during early adolescence than actually making new connections, which is interesting. But the making new connections not only happens, it's necessary. You would not be able to learn anything new. You would not remember anything if your brain didn't make new connections and new neurons. Like memory is based on making new connections. So that process continues throughout our entire lives. It is happening right now, I hope. Um, so to the extent that that's like, yes, this might actually connect with that idea of unfinalizability. So cognitively, yes, we go through periods where we're more flexible, but we are never finalized. We are constantly changing. And that offers some hope for even the mass shooters. But whether that actually gives you more empathy for those people, maybe I'll leave to the individual.
Thank you. Um, Other questions? As I mentioned, you can raise your hand, and I'm just sort of scrolling through to see if there are hands being raised. And it might take me a second since we have such a full house today. But other questions, please. Yes, Tatiana Kuzmich, please. I see your hand. Go ahead.
Hi, yes. Since Tom ended with the word empathy, I wanted to ask about uses of this approach in just promoting and even defending the humanities, which seems more necessary than ever. And I did see Keith Oatley's name on one of the slides, and he's done this work with mirror neurons and saying how reading literature is like a computer simulation for the brain. And I've noticed that when I did have a chance to teach cognitive approaches to Russian literature, students were very receptive to the modern psychological literature. So we read articles on unrequited love from contemporary social psychologists and talked about that in relation to Anna Karenina. So I was just thinking about using this as approach also in teaching and what your thoughts are on that. And even drawing undergrads that way who are very much interested in psychology and those everyday life approaches to literature.
Yeah, that is interesting. First of all, shout out to Tatiana, who has been doing work in this field and was not in the volume, but was in the Tolstoy Studies volume. So please check her work out. Um, I I kind of want to give two answers to this question. My first answer, I'm going to put my old man curmudgeon hat on and say when I hear the word, I apologize, Brett, because I know you like the topic, but when I hear the term neurons, I go for my gun. It was one of those bandwagons that was going on, and so it was kind of overdone. It's a fascinating topic, and it's a substantive topic, and Rizzolatti will probably get a Nobel Prize for the discovery at some point. But the idea, mirror neurons, for those who don't know, they're neurons that fire. They were first discovered in type of monkey, and they're neurons that fired, for instance, when a monkey reached for a cup, but they also fired when they saw someone else reach for a cup. So that's the mirror part. They saw someone else doing the action. And so the people ran with this idea and like, okay, these are imitation neurons and these are empathy neurons and these are neurons that are responsible for intersubjectivity and they're responsible for culture and they're responsible for imitation. Um, and the science doesn't seem to go much beyond their neurons for actual physical actions. There's some evidence that maybe they could be tied to the actual more subjective aspects of things, but I think some caution is responsible there. Um, but as far as like reaching out to students, yeah, this is the type of thing that I think gets attention, right? And that's kind of the name of the game, right? It's a thing that I think people in general and students are people that can grab their attention and can bring them in. So there's been work on, okay, stemming from Oatley that reading fiction is like a gym for your capacities of empathy and stuff. Like people who read more fiction are more empathic, and so people should read more fiction. Again, I would pour a little bit of cold water on that because the follow-up studies may or may not actually carry that out. I hate to say that because it would be great if it did. Um, but I think it's a good idea. Like if you're trying to teach a class on this, you teach the stuff that's going to be inherently interesting, right? And so mass murderers, that's an interesting topic. Um, the mirror neuron stuff, that's like kind of you can very quickly lay out that experiment, and that's interesting. That brings people in. Um, it's that type of stuff that brought me to the topic originally. It's just kind of inherently interesting, and there's a lot of people that are interesting in. So if we can find bridges to bring people that might not otherwise be interested in our classes, if we can use that to bring them over, then that's great. The empathy, I think that can definitely serve as a good bridge there. I apologize if I'm being curmudgeonly here.
So Tom, we have a question in the chat, and it's a couple of different questions. So I'll kind of break it up and kind of give you a chance to respond. So the question from historian Raymond Arend. You spoke of the author and characters and works and the reader as subjects of study, cognitive science and literature. Would you say that editors, publishers, even government censorship would figure into this analysis? And if so, how?
Off the hand, I can't think of anything. So I kind of want to return to what I said. I mean, it was sort of briefly that I I I don't like it when you get a hammer and everything turns into a nail, if you know what I mean. The approach should be applied where the approach can be productive and useful. And if you start over applying it to things where you could make the connection, it's just not productively used, then you're kind of wearing it out and people get suspicious. I think there was a couple like more popular. There was a book out called Madame Bovary's Ovaries, which aside from the wonderful title, just really did not do the field any good. I hate David Barish is a very talented writer and scientist, but basically it applied evolutionary logic to all sorts of texts, but the readings just were like, eh. And so like I was worried that people were going to read that book and then just like dismiss the entire approach when there were better, more useful approaches there. So I would caution against, you know, here's the thing I'm interested in. Let me make this cognitive. The tool needs to fit the task at hand. Could you make connections? Absolutely, because we'll come back to the issue of gaps. Censorship provides gaps. We inherently we're used to dealing with gaps. And so you could look at that in terms of, okay, how do we see when something is missing? How do we fill in the gaps cognitively? Is there some connection there with like the way that censorship was done and the way that art writers have gotten around censorship that then allow them to not fill in the gap, but let the reader fill in the gap themselves? There's definitely some work you could do there that could be interesting. It's probably nothing that's going to revolutionize the field, but like you think you could get a conference paper out of that.
And then the next part of the question, also from Raymond, is do you see translation as being some kind of a mediating factor here? That is to say, if someone is reading a translation of Chekhov in English or another language, it's not in the original, do you feel like cognitive approaches to literature have anything to say about the differences in how that text gets processed?
Yes, I like that question because as you noted, I started out my career in translation studies, looking at translation as a form of imitation, and then imitation, I got into the cognitive anthropological aspects of imitation, and that was how I got into this. Excuse me. Um, so we're getting into linguistics here as well. And sort of one of the I specifically grabbed my book here so I could grab it if necessary. So one of the things that I think is going on in cognitive studies in general is Chomskyism seems to steadily being chipped away at, right? I mean, I started out as like I was very to the extent that I was a linguistic, which I don't want to pretend to be, but like I got Chomsky largely through Steven Pinker's kind of watering down of it, but I liked that he watered it down because I didn't never really accept full on Chomsky, but like little bit by little bit, it seems like Chomsky's approach has been chipped away at and it's been watered down and watered down and watered down. And so one of the approaches that I think that is like stands to replace Chomsky in linguistics is so you have Terence Deacon, the symbolic species here. And I won't bore everyone for this. It's a good book. I suggest it. Um, but Deacon's work gets more into the relationship between, you know, long and parole and between the thing and the word and how exactly we set up the connections. And it's like it kind of works like how norm psychology works. Like it's the same basic idea that you can take any one thing, or symbolism in general, not just words. You can take any one thing and you can connect any concept or idea to it. But then what we do is we don't just do the motion doesn't just go up and down, word, thing, word, thing. You start getting word, thing, thing, and that's where you start getting symbolic resonances from. And those symbolic resonances sort of come together, and that's where you get culture and traditions and all of these higher level things. Um, um, and so an approach like that, it doesn't have to be that approach, but I think the more recent trends in cognitive science definitely have things to say about that, because one of the core issues of translation is, what are you actually translating when you translate? Are you translating Russian to English, or are you actually translating some higher level language that is not in a language, that's in some sort of, Pinker uses the word mentalese? Are you translating that? Are you translating basically from Russian to mentalese and then mentalese to English? Or are you translating directly from Russian to English? And so I think this is this fascinating concept that if you can think of it in terms of like you're actually going to this common language, translation sort of becomes much more feasible than like, oh, we don't have a word for Schadenfreude. Translation is impossible. To, well, no, everything has a mental representation. We all can tap into those same mental representations. And so translation is in fact quite possible. You just have to deal with the very, very messy issue of linguistic history and context and tradition and all of that. So I don't have a direct answer to it, nor would I want to answer such a question directly. But yes, I definitely think there's some there's some source there that could be used.
Thank you. Other questions from our audience? As I mentioned, if you have a question, you can go ahead and raise your hand either physically, or you can raise the little virtual hand on your Zoom tool panel below. Um, Kind of piggybacking off of that response, we have another question in the chat. Um, when you teach Russian literature in translation, especially for students who, haven't maybe studied the language, but are interested in these ideas, they've heard of these authors, for example. I see that Tatiana shared a really interesting article in the chat about, for better social skills, scientists recommend a little Chekhov, and little Chekhov is doable for probably most people.
Chekhov is little.
Exactly. How do you kind of take some of these theories or some of these research approaches and apply them when you teach these texts?
That's an interesting question. First of all, I don't teach anymore, at least not at the moment. So this is a hopefully in the future question. Um, that's interesting because I have, my disadvantage has always been that I'm in, Wheaton College is like basically a large high school, like the size that we are. I'm teaching core classes all the time. My typical thing was I would teach first year Russian, advanced Russian, and one culture class, right? That we'd kind of like cycle through as our students went through the program. So I never had the flexibility to really get into advanced stuff. Um, I never got to do anything that was like super specific. Like when I was at Penn, I was able to do a whole class on just Tolstoy or just Dostoevsky. Here I'm doing 19th century, 20th century. I had a class on like Central Asian and Caucasian literature. Um, so my personal experience is a bit limited from that perspective. But as terms of like pedagogy, one of the things that I'm kind of scandalized by is there we now have decades, certainly years, but decades of work about how we learn, how we memorize stuff, how reading processing works, and like sometimes it seems like to me as an outside that almost none of it has actually trickled down to like education. Like they do their thing, and the people studying how we learn and the people teaching people to teach, they're just like separate, worlds there. I hope that is wrong, but that's just an impression. But like I try to take some of what I've learned about how we learn and take it into how we would teach. Things like you can't give too much information at once, right? The thing about their brains are mostly formed right by the time they're 20s, right? You have to teach a 20-year-old differently than you teach a 15-year-old. Like they process differently. Give things in small packages. You learn better when you actually use something than when you're just being lectured to. But on the other hand, lectures aren't bad just as a means of giving information to people. You just can't give them too much information at once. You do one thing, you have them use it, you have them apply it, you do another thing. Like that's all consistent with what I read as what about how we process information and how we learn.
Yes, Tatiana.
Okay, just had to make sure I unmute myself. I just wanted to say that I did over a decade ago when that article in the New York Times was published, have a chance to teach Russian literature and include psychology. It started with a colleague in psychology. So what we did was we would combine literature with an article that discusses the topic of adultery with Anna Karenina, with Raskolnikov. We went with narcissism, right, with his essay.
Yeah.
And this is, again, this is something students really take to, and sometimes it also gets them to read more carefully. So, for example, there was work on people's use of I and you pronouns, depending how powerful or powerless they're feeling. And so we actually took a passage in which Anna Karenina and her husband have their first fight after he finds out about her infidelity and who's saying I and who's saying you more and how it switches at some point. So it's something that students are naturally interested in, and anything that has to do with romance is going on in their own lives. And so I almost felt like the articles like that or works like that allowed me to get them to naturally desire to read more carefully. They're actually counting the words. So in that way, it can be helpful just to make it relevant.
Yeah, anything. I mean, anything. But that's true. That's true beyond just like psychological approach. Like anything that can be used as a springboard. I mean, that's just good teaching, right? You're using something else that will help kind of bridge the students to the topic. But and I want to wholeheartedly support the teaching with other people in other departments. Humanities, we just sort of have this ethos of like we work all by ourselves in our own offices, and our articles have one byline on them. Whereas you go to the sciences and they have 2, 3, 5, 20, 100 people listed on an article. They're working together all the time, and I think that's something we could learn from the sciences, from more cooperation with other scholars, more joint work, more joint teaching is fantastic. I love that idea.
Thank you. Any other questions that folks would like to bring up? And I think also, as Tatiana so brilliantly showed, it doesn't necessarily have to be a direct question, but if something has resonated with you or kind of has insight for your teaching, I think that that would be really helpful as well. And I get another thing that has come up in the chat too, and Tom, I don't uh, want to sort of bring forth the curmudgeon again, and I'm not trying to, but do you have thoughts about AI? Is there a way that AI can be productive to the kinds of cognitive approaches we're talking about pulling in students, or do you feel like it's a little bit too early to say that there can be some productive ways we can use these new technologies?
I have an answer to that. I'm not exactly how much it's just my own personal thing as opposed to informed by the scholarship. I think maybe like I can say the aspect of like in order to learn something, in order to make something your own, which is like part of learning, right? You need to take something else that is not you and you need to make it you. In order to do that, you must use it, you must do it, and AI takes that away. You put in the prompt, it gives you an answer, it does you absolutely no good, right? You don't actually learn anything from that process. But like, I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir on that element there, right? There's nothing new about that observation. If anybody wants any, like, one little tidbit I might be able to throw at that might give someone some comfort is we get into the issue of consciousness, like AI is going to take over, right? um my reading of the research is a thing isn't going to become fully conscious unless it until it is a point where it has its own body with senses that needs to go out and get its own energy. And until you have the point where you have robots that are doing that, you are not going to have conscious entities with free will. So there might be a little bit of comfort about the future of AI there. But yeah, everything I know is the passive use of AI is bad for learning. I will allow for the possibility that there are more active uses of, like, AI is a tool, right? A hammer can build a house or it can bludgeon someone's head in. It all depends on how it's used. Certain tools are lean more in one direction than in the other direction. AI can be used productively, but you need to take control.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments from our audience? If not, I don't see any other hands. So I'll take this opportunity once again. Thank you, Tom, for such a fascinating talk. I hope everyone checks out the volume from their libraries because
Order it for your school library, please.
it really seems like there's just a wide range of things for people to learn and sort of absorb.
There's at least something for everyone, but I think multiple things for everyone.
And with that, Fran, please add anything that I might be forgetting. But we are looking at maybe having another talk for this semester, but we're not 100% sure. So please do keep an eye on your emails, your social media, and we'll let you know. Fran, anything else to add on our series on health matters?
I was going to say that if any of you are interested in presenting, if you have new books out, or know somebody who has a new book out that is relevant to thinking about health very broadly, medicine, science, please get in touch with us. We would love to hear from you.
Absolutely. So thanks again so much, everyone. And go out there, take care of yourselves, take care of your students. We're so happy to have had you here with us today.
Thank you.
Tom.